Welcome to Player Profiler News Primetime. I'm your host, Jeremiah Retzlaff. You can find me on X at Coach Retzlaff1. Mike is not with us tonight. It'll just be me. We are reading and reacting to this rapid fire information that we have about DeAndre Hopkins, Tennessee Titans wide receiver, out 4 to 6 weeks with a knee injury. The 4-week timeline puts DeAndre Hopkins on the path for possibly playing week 1. And of course, the 6-week timeline may push into week 3 and possibly further, depending on the recovery. Remember, DeAndre Hopkins is 32 years old, so it takes some older players longer to recover. And we understand with age comes just more frailty, and Father Time is undefeated. So today I want to run through the Titans ADP with you, and then I want to talk about players at DeAndre Hopkins ADP and how to react to them. And then I'm going to go over my Titans exposure and how to move forward. And we will start off with Coach's Corner. So here we have the Tennessee Titans ADP. Now, I had done weeks ago a Titans rundown on Coach's Corner regarding ADP, where they're at. So I've made some amendments, some notes based on all this information with DeAndre Hopkins, how we should react. The two lightning rod players are, of course, DeAndre Hopkins, but his counterpart, Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley is now going in the 5th round on Underdog, wide receiver 35. A note on Ridley, he was number 1 in route participation last year at 100%. 14th in targets at the wide receiver position, 3rd in red zone targets with 25. Now, there's all those laughable targets where Calvin Ridley dropped the ball in the end zone, and people are talking about Trevor Lawrence and what Trevor Lawrence could be. But let's talk about Calvin Ridley being able to draw all those targets. If Calvin Ridley is going to continue to be a target magnet, I feel like regression is going to occur for Calvin Ridley, and those numbers will go up for him in the red zone. I see a touchdown boost from last year. Now, with Calvin Ridley, the target tree is going to narrow. DeAndre Hopkins is now out 4 to 6 weeks with this injury. That's going to put DeAndre Hopkins at the very least on this slow path recovery early in the season, to where it could be a slow start anywhere from week 1 to week 4, maybe week 5. The older a player is, the harder it is to recover from injuries. And this is a lower body injury for DeAndre Hopkins. D-Hop as well is not a speedy burner who's going to get by people. He relies on his physicality, being able to jump up and get that ball. So DeAndre Hopkins right now goes in round 6. We will see an ADP dip for DeAndre Hopkins. Currently, D-Hop is going wide receiver 40. Again, 32 years old. He was number 2 in deep targets in 2023 with 35. Number 2 in air yards with 1,905 yards. He had, DeAndre Hopkins, 75 receptions, over 1,000 yards receiving, and 7 touchdowns in 2023. Now, accordion out, we're not going to lose the entire season of production from DeAndre Hopkins, but for a player who's been dwindling down and declining some, with Calvin Ridley coming into town, really right now, Calvin Ridley is going to be like Pac-Man and gobble up a lot of shares of the football early on in the season. So this first month for best ball, for redraft, you want Calvin Ridley on your teams. So with all the drafting that you've been doing on Underdog, you're going to want to take a pause on DeAndre Hopkins and wait until his ADP settles on a dip. And of course, you're going to want to be like Pac-Man and scoop up Calvin Ridley as much as possible. This will shoot Calvin Ridley's ADP up. So part of your thought and your frame has to understand that versus the field in tournaments that are open right now on Underdog, you are going to lose some ADP value from the people who have been clicking on Calvin Ridley. But don't fret. There's 18 rounds. There's hordes of players that you can take advantage of in the market. But right now, for people who have been in on Calvin Ridley and people who have been in on DeAndre Hopkins, there's a divergence between the two. So if you are all in or highly in on Ridley, you're very happy about that today. If you're highly in on D-Hop and you've been out on Ridley, you're feeling real sore today. But if you have a little bit of both, like myself, I'm starting to think, okay, I got to cool off on DeAndre Hopkins, but I'm going to incorporate my clicks for Calvin Ridley. Now let's go over to the less obvious. Where will the football go now without DeAndre Hopkins? With Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears, their ADPs are converging. They are now 7 picks apart on Underdog. Tony Pollard right now is RB29. 72 red zone touches last year, was number 2 at the running back position. So we could see the Titans go to Tony Pollard. We've seen in training camp Will Levis launching the ball in the passing game to Tony Pollard. Tyjae Spears, okay, Pollard, RB29. Spears is RB31. Tyjae Spears was number 9 in running back receptions in 2023 with 52. Spears was 5th in breakaway run rate at 7%. So for efficiency metrics, Spears was number 5 in yards created per touch with 4.58. We had talked earlier, it was almost a month ago, where it is going to be throw mode for the Tennessee Titans. I don't expect that to change with DeAndre Hopkins out. Granted, I do see this hurting Will Levis some. It takes away some of that bullishness that we have for Will Levis because a horde of weapons out there and available for a young quarterback in Will Levis, of course you're going to want that. So not having DeAndre Hopkins now for 4 to 6 weeks is going to hurt Will Levis early in the season. Now, we're not hearing anything about any longer term than that. So the alarm is sounding, but I want us to caution on too much panic on DeAndre Hopkins here. He's not dead per se for your best ball teams. It's just this early chunk. We're already starting to see the possibility of that first quarter of the season where you're still trying to not have zeros at your positions. This is tough for DeAndre Hopkins being out. And DeAndre Hopkins, where it is tough, is DeAndre Hopkins is such a valuable pick in round 6. And we'll talk about players at DeAndre Hopkins ADP who you could benefit from clicking going forward. So the loss isn't just DeAndre Hopkins being out. It's the fact that you've been drafting DeAndre Hopkins maybe sometimes in the 5th round, 6th round, 7th round. Now with Will Levis, Levis is QB 15 he's going in the 15th round as QB 24. I've been bullish on the Titans. This doesn't change the fact that I'm bullish on the Titans, but it just puts a slight dent in the fact that we want Will Levis to completely take off. But it narrows what we like for Calvin Ridley. So we can just say, hey, Calvin Ridley to the moon, at least early on in the season. Now, just a note on Chigakonkwo, there's been no buzz for him. And he actually has some competition in Josh Wiley. Josh Wiley is going as tight end 46, catching buzz and praise from coaches in training camp. Check out Player Profiler News, our website. We have some write-ups on Josh Wiley. And where else are you going to hear about Josh Wiley but at Player Profiler News? And then Tyler Boyd going in round 17. There's a small opening here for Tyler Boyd, and it's going to raise him some. So his ADP could go maybe into the 16th round, maybe into the 15th, but I wouldn't expect too rapid of a ADP increase for Tyler Boyd. You're really going to see it sharply with Calvin Ridley up at the top. And then Treylon Burks, for people who are out there with the hopium for Treylon Burks, just do not fall for the trap. And now I'm going to go over to the full rankings, and let's show up players at DeAndre Hopkins ADP. We want to make sure we are looking at DeAndre Hopkins. There he is, 68.4, very sharp at the moment. The players who are going just ahead of him, let's read off some names. Rashee Rice. We like Rashee Rice in the 6th round. Rashee Rice is nice. Rashee Rice is climbing. Rashee Rice doesn't look like he'll have a suspension at all. So now you go from DeAndre Hopkins, Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice isn't going to miss time, it doesn't seem, with the suspension risk. And now you have DeAndre Hopkins, who it sounds like he's almost for sure going to miss at least one game to start the season. You want Kyle Pitts, Joe Mixon, Rachaad White are ahead of DeAndre Hopkins by a couple picks. And then, of course, you got Xavier Worthy. You want shares of that Chiefs offense. So, of course, you're going to want to click on Xavier Worthy. George Kittle, a stud elite tight end. You want to be taking a lot of George Kittle, especially with the fact that Brandon Ayuk could possibly get traded. Is there a deal that's out there for Brandon Ayuk as we record this? We could even hear that there's an Ayuk deal. Roma Dunze, definitely going to be much more popular than DeAndre Hopkins. Let's go past DeAndre Hopkins. Deontay Johnson, the number one receiver in Carolina, will likely vault up ahead of DeAndre Hopkins. Christian Watson, who has his own injury risk, has been sitting here at this ADP. We're going to see a dip for DeAndre Hopkins, and I don't see Christian Watson staying below DeAndre Hopkins for too much longer. Lab McConkey will jump him. Okay, more reports will come out about Lab McConkey being the number one in the Chargers offense, although there could be some caution with this Justin Herbert injury. So that might be one in real time as I'm sorting this through. That might level out a little bit with DeAndre Hopkins. Brian Thomas Jr., who's further down, Evan Ingram, the two players on the Jacksonville Jaguars who are being drafted here, are on that other side of the Tennessee Titans Week 17 matchup. Give me Brian Thomas. Give me Evan Ingram. Going down to JSN, I'll want to click JSN over DeAndre Hopkins. Now, let me come over to what I've completed, my exposure. I'm going to pull up the Tennessee Titans and just read through how I'm approaching them going forward. My exposures on Underdog, Tyjae Spears, 15.3%. You love to see it. I'm going to keep on clicking Tyjae Spears. DeAndre Hopkins, all right, the man of the hour, 13.5% drafted. I have higher exposure to him than the requisite 8% of the field or the cozy blanket 4% of the field, right? So now what I'm going to do, my bags are packed for DeAndre Hopkins. All right, August is a great month for vacations. I am going to pack my bags for DeAndre Hopkins and keep him where he's at and wait to see how far he falls in drafts and then maybe scoop value later, but emphasis on later. I'll cool off on DeAndre Hopkins. Will Levis, this doesn't change my outlook too much. It puts a little dent in my overall Titans outlook early in the season, but they're at 11.8%. I'm fine with that total rising. Calvin Ridley, there he is, 11.2%. I have some drafts outstanding, about 30 to 40 right now, and I actually clicked OTC today when this news hit. I was able to click Calvin Ridley right there at his ADP. So Calvin Ridley, not Alvin. Calvin Ridley's going to go up, and I'm just going to let DeAndre Hopkins sit there, rostership-wise, and then you will see, for me, for my rostership, Ridley is going to rise and surpass. He's only 2% behind. So I'm in a situation where I've got a little bit of an even exposure. I'm not too panicked, but I do feel a little bit of a punch for those teams where maybe I just have DeAndre Hopkins, but those teams where I just have Calvin Ridley, I'm euphoric, right? Because I've got an ADP advantage versus the field. Whereas the teams where I just have DeAndre Hopkins in the 6th round and somebody else in that room has Calvin Ridley. And then, of course, in the tournament, other people have Calvin Ridley against me. I'm feeling it a little bit there. So it's just kind of like good, bad at the same time. I'm effectively neutral right now as far as how much I'm tilting or not, right? I'm very even keeled right now. I'm in a good spot. I'm really in a good place. Tyler Boyd at 7.1%. I'm not going to force rostership to go higher on him. The forced rostership from myself and from the field is going to come from Calvin Ridley. And then Chiga Conquo down here, 4%. Tony Pollard, 2.9%. I'm going to try and raise Tony Pollard. I don't think I'll be able to get Tony Pollard even with Tyjae Spears, but that's A-okay and fine by me because conviction take, I am all in more so on Tyjae Spears than Tony Pollard, but I have been trying to, from a portfolio standpoint, incorporate some more Tony Pollard. So maybe I can get Tony Pollard up to 5, maybe between 5 and 8% exposure. And then Josh Wiley, the guy we talked about earlier, the Tennessee Titans tight end to possibly look out for. He's there. He's just a deep cut, deep sleeper. I'm really only involving Josh Wiley on some Titans builds, anything that would involve maybe the Jacksonville Jaguars, where Wiley becomes just a very unique click. So just to rehash, DeAndre Hopkins is out 4 to 6 weeks with a knee injury. There's a 4-week timeline. We're thinking week 1 is a possibility, but why rush with a 32-year-old wide receiver? Remember, this entire receiver core between Ridley, D-Hop, and Boyd, they're all 29 or older. So this is an older core. So why rush D-Hop back when you still want to incorporate for keeping Calvin Ridley and Tyler Boyd healthy? So we have our first ADP conundrum. We have the rush and euphoria of you going to your best ball streets and checking your exposures to see how much DeAndre Hopkins do I have? How much Calvin Ridley do I have? And then you're thinking about moves for moves, players for players. We've talked about the Tennessee Titans here and how we're finagling and finessing selecting them. But also when we went through the players at ADP, you start having to run the exercise with DeAndre Hopkins and players at ADP. So it's an entire ripple effect of a huge part of the board. And then it can even affect how we stack different teams. And then, of course, we went over my Titans exposure, and that's just a little insight of how I would like to move forward. If you're somebody who finds yourself having a lot of Calvin Ridley, you're just in a great place right now. So hopefully you enjoy the Texans and Bears game tonight and go out there and keep drafting away. This won't be the last news that we have, but it's some of the first big news that we have. I will see you next week.